So welcome back again from the break. Hopefully you took a break to give your brain a chance, your mind a chance to clear out a little bit. There's a lot of information in that first section, I realized, and a lot of new terminology and a lot of new ideas to get used to. But that's the nature of this class and dealing with with the diversity of life as we know it, and plants are part of that diversity, and it is a brand new game when we start talking about plants. Anyway, let's look at the concept check questions, and then we'll get a look at the bryophytes and move through those pretty quickly. So why are charophytes thought to be the group of algae most closely related to plants? Well, remember, there are the 4 primitive traits that we recognize: the roseate complex that produces the cellulose. You have the presence of the sporopollen. We can throw that one in there. It's not one that was listed in the list, but it is one that we can put in there. You have the idea that I'm having a senior moment at the moment, and I'm not entirely sure why, because these are things that usually I can recite off really quickly. The formation of the phragmoplast, the structure of the sperm, and the fact that you've got walled spores with the sporopollen, or the sporopollen in the wall, protecting the spores. I've got an idea that I've left something out there. So we've got, I'm having a real senior moment right now. I apologize for this. I'm not sure why, because this is right in my wheelhouse. I am a plant scientist by training. This is what I really enjoy talking about. So we've got the roseate complex, the phragmoplast, the structure of the sperm. We can also throw in there the genetics of and biochemistry of photosynthesis. These are all things that are shared in common between plants and charophytes. I know I'm missing one of the major points, and I can't remember why, and I don't want to go scrolling back through the slides to take a look at it. But there are a list of a number that you can focus on. Identify and explain the 4 derived traits of plants that contribute to life on land. So we had 5 on the list of derived traits that you could see in plants, but not all of them necessarily contribute to life on the land. But there are some that most definitely contribute to life on the land. So the presence of walled spores with the sporopollen that prevents them from drying out, that's one, most distinctive. Second one is the presence of the apical meristems that support the growth of the plant, and that leads to the expansion of the plant body in the soil, and also gives the plant the opportunity to expand in size, and once there is something to resist gravity, to grow up and to produce leaves and shoots and expand and become a dominant feature of the landscape. The support of the embryo, the retention of the embryo in the body of the plant to give it a chance to develop before it has to survive on its own. That's also a derived trait. So the concept of plants as embryophytes. The gametangium are not really considered to be a feature that is considered to be valuable in terms of survival on land, but the alternation of generations most certainly is. That's not particularly obvious in terms of the general life cycle as we've talked about it. But hopefully, as we talk about the bryophyte life cycle and show how alternation of generations occurs there, and then show how the remaining 3 life cycles are modifications that lead to better adaptation to dry land, you'll understand why the alternation of generations actually does promote life on land or increased success as a terrestrial organism for the plants. So there are the 4 derived traits that are clearly derived traits that lead to increased success of plants as colonizers of dry land. So let's take a look at the bryophytes. So when we take a look at the extant bryophytes, we find them as being very small, non-woody plants. The term that we use in plant science is herbaceous. It's just a fancy word that means non-woody. So you have herbaceous plants, you have woody plants. There are 3 phyla that I've identified for you before the break. So we have Hepatophyta, the liverworts, Anthocerophyta, the hornworts, Bryophyta, the mosses. We do believe that the Hepatophyta, the liverworts, are the most basal, the first to emerge from the common ancestor or the pool of common ancestors that were colonizing dry land early on, then followed by the mosses and ultimately by the hornworts. When we look at the fossils that are available for these early colonizers of land, the fossils and particularly the spores are very similar to those that we see in living liverworts, which is the reason why we place the liverworts most basal to the plant kingdom. So when we think in terms of the life cycle itself, the best way to take a look at the life cycle is to actually look at the diagram. So there's a description of the life cycle, some of the life cycle features here. But there are a couple of ideas that you need to remember that are really important. Bryophytes are always ground-hugging plants. They are ground cover plants, and they grow in very, very moist environments, and they do so for 2 reasons. Number 1, the reason why they are small is because they lack vascular tissue. So the only thing that they can use is diffusion. Oops. I'm going to move this out of the way for a moment. So let's fire up the pen. I rely on diffusion. Let's spell that correctly. And because they're relying on diffusion, that limits them to movement over a couple of cell distances. Diffusion as a process usually is only effective over a distance of about 2 to 3 cell diameters. So if all you've got for moving water and nutrients through the body of the plant is diffusion, you need to keep it very small so that no cell is more than 2 to 3 cells removed from the surface of the plant. And then because they have a flagellated sperm, there's this requirement for water. They require water for reproduction so that the sperm can actually swim from the antheridium to the archegonium. So in the bryophytes, whether we're talking about hornworts, liverworts, or mosses, the archegonium and the antheridium are located on separate gametophytes. So given that the distance is relatively large, it could be several millimeters up to a couple of centimeters even for some of these. That's a reasonable distance for the sperm to swim over. And that means you need more than just a couple of drops of water. You need a substantial body of water to allow the sperm to swim that distance from one gametophyte to the second gametophyte, from the male to the female gametophyte, in order for reproduction to occur. So this is the reason why bryophytes tend to be really small and also grow in very moist environments. They also do not have roots. They have these features called rhizoids. These are simply best described as extensions of the cuticle, or the epidermal cells, probably better. So these are primarily used to anchor the plant. They're not used very much for taking up water and minerals. That is more the function of the fungi that are working in conjunction or living in symbiosis with these plants. That tends to give them the access to the minerals and the water that they need access to. The rhizoids are more about anchoring to the substrate, what they're growing on, rather than uptake of water and minerals. And then, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, some mosses have what we could refer to as very primitive vascular tissue that allows them to move water and minerals over larger distances. So they tend to grow a little bit more vertically, but they are still limited in terms of the environments that they can penetrate. They're still limited because of their flagellated sperm. They're still limited because they still have to rely primarily on diffusion to move things away from this conducting tissue out to the cells that surround them. So they are still limited very much in terms of how big they can get, so they still are more or less ground cover. When we take a look at the life cycle, maybe I should move this a little bit higher up for the time being, we can follow through the life cycle by focusing on the dominant form in the landscape, and they are said to be gametophyte dominant. So the life cycle and again, this is a unique feature of bryophytes. So here we're looking at a moss life cycle as illustrative of the typical bryophyte life cycle. So remember, mosses are bryophyta, but bryophyte is the non-taxonomic term that we use for these non-vascular plants. And it really illustrates the typical life cycle. So if we start with the gametophytes, we have the male gametophyte with the antheridia. So remember, the antheridium is the male gametangium. So it is a haploid structure. The gametophyte itself is haploid. The antheridium is haploid. The cells inside the antheridium are haploid, and they are going to produce sperm by mitosis. So the sperm are produced in the antheridia by mitosis. They need to swim through a fairly substantial amount of water to make it across to the archegonium, which is found in the female gametophyte. So you have the archegonium on the female gametophyte, usually on the tip of the gametophyte. Inside the archegonium, the eggs are developing at the base of the archegonium. The sperm enter the top of the archegonium, swim down and fertilize the egg in the base of the archegonium. That gives rise to our zygote. The zygote now starts to grow inside the archegonium. giving rise to the embryo and ultimately the sporophyte, which emerges in the case of the vast majority of mosses as a thing called a seta with a capsule. This is the sporophyte. So this whole feature is the sporophyte. And notice it is non-photosynthetic. Which means it's incapable of supporting itself. It is totally dependent on the gametophyte. Okay. But the whole value of the sporophyte is that it has a sporangium on the end of it in this structure called a capsule. So within the sporangium, diploid cells undergo meiosis. So you've got the sporocytes in there undergoing meiosis, giving rise to the spores. The spores get coated in the sporopollenin. That then, when they're ready for dispersal, the capsule ruptures, releasing the spores, and they get released into the environment, coated in their sporopollenin to prevent them from drying out. When they land, hopefully they land in an environment that is conducive to their germination. So the spores germinate, and the haploid cell contained within the spore starts growing and gives rise to the multicellular haploid structure that becomes the gametophyte, either the male gametophyte or the female gametophyte, depending on what it develops into. So this is the classic bryophyte life cycle. All the bryophytes go through a life cycle very similar to this. There are obviously going to be some slight modifications because of the nature of a liverwort versus a hornwort versus a moss. But basically, you see a similar sort of life cycle in terms of the stages that are followed here. And again, its unique feature is the fact that the gametophyte, the haploid stage, is the dominant stage of the life cycle. That's what you see when you see a moss in the environment. So, as I mentioned, the sporophyte grows out of the archegonium. It is totally dependent on the gametophyte. The hornwort and some of the moss sporophytes, not all moss sporophytes, and I should classify this, can do gas exchange, but they are more or less incapable of photosynthesis. They do get their support directly out of the gametophyte, which has the capacity to do photosynthesis. In terms of the liverworts compared to the mosses, liverworts are a lot smaller. As I mentioned, their life cycle is very similar to that of a moss, but they do have one feature that mosses don't have. They can reproduce asexually. So this is unique to liverworts. You're not going to see this in any of the other bryophytes. So mosses and hornworts do not do this. This is a little haploid structure, a little cluster of cells that grows on the surface of the leaf-like feature of the hornwort. If it gets hit by a raindrop, it can get dislodged and float away and develop into a new plant. Basically, it's a form of asexual reproduction. It's a cloning of the original parental plant. And so this is something that liverworts can do that hornworts and mosses can't do. So this is something that is very unique to liverworts. And here you can see a typical liverwort, in this case Marcantia, which is considered to be the classic liverwort. If you look really carefully on the leaf of what is known as the thallus of the liverwort, here are some gemmae. Or gemma cups. So those are the structures that, when dislodged from the thallus, this leaf-like structure of the liverwort, can then drift again. They can then float away to settle down and develop into a new a new liverwort. Hornworts, again, look a little bit more like liverworts than mosses. The reason why they're called hornworts is because the sporophyte has the appearance of a horn-like arrangement with the sporangium located at the top. So this is a developing sporangium on the tip of the sporophyte, and it will produce the spores that get released into the environment to become the new gametophytes that become the next generation of hornworts. Then mosses are probably the most obvious part of the bryophytes, and these are the ones that have the phylum name Bryophyta. They are somewhat important in the landscape because they have a wide distribution. They are primary colonizers. So this is a really important feature of the mosses. As primary colonizers, they can break down virgin rock and release the minerals, and also break it down into small particles that becomes the foundation for soil. They have the capacity to store nitrogen in the soil and contribute to supporting follow-up colonizers. So these are really important in establishing new ecosystems when virgin land forms. And we see this particularly on volcanic material, where you have lava that is cooled down enough that organisms can start colonizing it. In the case of plants, it is almost always mosses, or if it's not mosses, it's a couple of other plants that come from some of the other groups that we can look at. But mosses are almost always some of the first colonizers of virgin volcanic area. And there's actually an island off the southern coast of Iceland called Surtsey that emerged out of the ocean about 25, 30 years ago now. And biologists have convinced the Icelandic government to basically cordon off the island. You can't land on the island without specific permission. And the reason why this has been done is because biologists want to follow the colonization of this virgin island and see what takes place as organisms sequentially arrive on the island to colonize this new ground. And they did discover that mosses were one of the very first colonizers amongst the plant kingdom. Subsequently, insects have turned up, spiders and other arthropods, including insects, that have taken advantage of the presence of the mosses and other plants that have followed on from the mosses. Another important feature of mosses is their ability to sequester large amounts of carbon. And this is seen particularly in peat bogs. So peat is basically partially fossilized peat moss, and this represents a form of fuel that has been used in traditional cultures where peat has been available. So in Ireland, in Scotland, in northern England, in parts of Europe, we have these large peat bogs that contain this fossilized peat material. You can see that it's cut out into squares. These are left to dry out and can then be burnt as a form of fossil fuel. So this material didn't turn into coal. It's part way along to forming coal, but it never quite fossilized well enough to form coal, but it still represents a form of fossil fuel. In terms of the structure, polytrichum is another type of moss here that has the capsule. So here's the capsule. This is the sporophyte growing out of this gametophyte. So it's been labeled there, but I'm just going to pull it out there. And then you've got the gametophyte. So at the base of this sporophyte, you'll have a female gametophyte. With the archegonium. Remember, fertilization takes place in the archegonium and the sporophyte grows out of there. So these are the features that you're going to see when you look at a typical moss. So what is the economic importance of mosses? As I've said, they can help form soil. They can help retain nitrogen in the soil. So here you can see the effect of a moss on nitrogen retention in soil. And so with the presence of moss, you get a retention of nitrogen, because this is actually documenting how much nitrogen is lost. So here, the small number is better than the big number, because this is the amount of nitrogen that's been lost from the soil. So the small number with the moss means that nitrogen has been retained in the soil. In the absence of moss, nitrogen is lost from the soil. This is why a lot of potting soils that you can grow from you can buy from nurseries to grow potted plants contains moss for two reasons. Number one, and it's typically peat moss. Number one, it improves water retention, because we know that mosses are perfectly capable of tolerating the complete dehydration of the moss body and still recover when water comes back again. So they retain a lot of water and they can survive the loss of water. And so it adds water retention properties to the potting soil and to the soils in which the mosses are growing. And number two, they aid in the retention of nitrogen in the soil. And so that's an added advantage for plants that are growing in the soil, and obviously for your potted plants. I happen to have, as part of my plant collection right now, some carnivorous plants, some pitcher plants and Venus flytraps, and they are actually planted in a pot that contains a large amount of moss, and that moss is living moss, not dead moss, it's living moss. And this is to replace the more swampy soil that these plants typically grow in. They have a lot of trouble growing in dry soil. They like really damp soil, but it also means they have issues with nitrogen, which is the reason why they are carnivorous. They're capturing the insects to get access to nitrogen. But growing in a pot that contains a substantial amount of moss means that the little pot that they're growing in also retains moisture and retains a certain amount of nitrogen that they can benefit from, just in case they can't catch enough insects. Then peat moss, I've already explained what peat moss is doing. It retains a lot of carbon. So you can see that it's retaining a lot of carbon here. It can also act as a tanning agent. So this is a individual who died and fell into one of these swamps, and his body has been perfectly preserved because his skin has been tanned. Literally, it's been turned to leather because of the presence of materials in the plant material called tannic acids. And those tannic acids are the original tanning agents that people use to turn animal skin into leather. When an individual falls into a similar sort of solution, their skin gets tanned as well. It gets turned into leather. And so this individual has been perfectly preserved as a consequence of this. So those are the bryophytes. As I said, a very short section, comparatively speaking. We will stop here again. So let me just read out the concept check question, and then I'll stop the recording and I'll meet you back here on the other side of the break with the answer. So how does the life cycle of bryophytes differ from other plants? See you on the other side of the break.